Thanks for checking out this movie review video. So this is for the 2015 film Body, and even though it is a kind of newer film, because I'm reviewing this at about 6 years since it's been out, this will be a spoiler-filled review. So I'm really going to dive into it, talk spoilers, and talk analysis and all that good stuff. This one is written and directed by Dan Berk, who also directed The Stake Lander, and Robert Olsen, who wrote scripts for Kill It, Don't Kill It, and Villains. I did see Villains, and I wasn't a huge fan of Villains. It felt like the characters didn't feel real. They felt very odd, and a lot of the stuff that happened in the film just felt very off to me. But that said, I enjoyed Body a lot more, just saying. Influences on the script for this were reported to be Shallow Grave, The Shining, Funny Games, and Wolf Creek, all good options. Although I don't really see the Wolf Creek tie-in personally, so I don't know if that one's even true. So it was said by the filmmakers that the characters in this film represent Sigmund Freud's id, ego, and superego. So Callie, the character of Callie being the id, Holly being the superego, and Mel being the ego. So if people don't know, basically the id is kind of like the more wild, impulsive, uncontrolled aspect of people's personality. The superego is the much more reserved and moral and always looking to do the right thing and more kind of internalized aspect of a personality. And the ego is what sits in the middle to kind of listen to both sides in a sense, which you see in this film, and then make a final decision. So that said, I don't think it was executed in the best way if this is what they were trying to do. It was executed well, but I will make some recommendations at the end of this review for kind of what they could have done a little bit better to kind of get the id, ego, and superego idea across even better. But to some people not thinking in the terms of Sigmund Freud language, it just looks like very different personalities in these three women and how they choose to go, because they have very distinct ways that they think that's set up very early in the film. So yeah, I like the choice to open with a 911 call while the opening credits roll. Not only is it something for you to focus on while you're just seeing these names rolling, but it's a good way to kind of set the stage for where you're going. It's also a great reference point that you think about much later on when you see them kind of like working on getting themselves worked up and starting to hyperventilate before they make that 911 call. I found myself definitely thinking back to that opening and thinking, oh man, this is exactly what was going on then. The whole Satin versus Satan gag when they're playing Scrabble, that's one that just made me think to the WNUF Halloween special, because that shows up in that. There's like a part where they're talking about like Satan worshiping and there's graffiti, and they show some graffiti that says Satin instead of Satan. So it just made me think about that. I don't know if it's something that they took from it because this was 2 years after WNUF, but I mean, probably not. That's a small film, but good film. What is with the dad wearing the sunglasses inside at night? It was weird. I guess they just threw it in for like a quirk factor to make things kind of funny-ish. They do reference it later. I guess that's Mel. It's her dad. So she references it later, and she's just like, oh, he still smokes weed even though he's an old man, and he just doesn't want people to see his bloodshot eyes all the time. But it seemed like a real throwaway thing. I don't know why they really had it in there. It was just a waste of time. But to that point, there wasn't a whole lot of time actually wasted in this film, because the runtime with credits and everything is like an hour and 14 minutes, which I'm all about that. Like, don't feel like you have to stretch a film to get to a certain runtime, and these filmmakers did not do that, and I applaud them greatly for not giving into that urge to hit a certain runtime. They took as long as they needed to. It felt like they took as long as they needed to. It kept the story relatively succinct and moving, and the pacing was good for that reason. So kudos. The character relationships that get established seem very real, especially early on. The whole like banter going on amongst the three women, it feels like they're friends. It feels like they've been friends. It feels like this is naturally how they interact with each other, and ripping on each other, making jokes. It all feels very familiar to people who have been in friendships like that, like myself. Ben, who was the guy who Holly was seeing, being talked to on the phone so early in the film actually made me think that he would end up turning out to be like some killer, because it's one of those things where like when a lot of films they want to introduce someone kind of early if they're going to be, you know, the bad guy in the end, and then they take them away basically so that you don't hear about them for a while, you kind of forget about them, but they were there, and then they pop back up and it's like, ah, they're the killer. Maybe I've been watching too much Giallo, because Giallo does that a lot, but so I thought that Ben would end up being a killer, but he doesn't. He just added in there to kind of be one of those moments of extra tension where he shows up to the house and they're trying to deal with this body situation. Haha, the title of the film. And they have to figure out a way to get him to leave, which I did think was well shot. Like, you definitely felt that tension at the time. Public service announcement. Leaving a spare key right outside of your house is never a good idea. Obviously, at first you think they're going to Callie's uncle's place, but then you find out, oh, it's just some people that she had babysat for at one point. So really, they're just breaking in. Although, technically they're breaking in, but they're not really breaking in because they just found a key. And that's why, in retrospect, Callie had such a hard time finding that key. She was just making an assumption that there would be a spare key somewhere, and these people were stupid enough to actually leave a spare key outside. People, literally, do not do that. That is very unsafe. Never do that. Never, never, never do that. This is one example why this film. You know something bad is coming when the music turns dark while Holly dances and spins in slow motion. Everything seems very normal, seems very upbeat, even keel. And then when they're like partying at this house and, you know, Holly's spinning in slow motion as she's dancing, the music starts to come way down. So it starts to give you this feeling of foreboding, foreshadowing. Here comes something. It's about to get messed up. And it does, not too long after that. Then Holly walks away from the safety of the group, so you have a feeling that something's about to happen. Now, something doesn't happen right then, but it's kind of setting up this this moment of like no more safety, because the whole time all three of them are together and there's, you know, safety in numbers type thing. And then once she breaks away, it kind of gives her and the audience a moment to break away from being hyper focused on the fun and the partying and what they're doing and the friendship, to starting to really question things and being like, is this actually her uncle's house? And why are there pictures of people who are a much different race than her? Which she does try to say, oh, you know, adopted family members, whatever, which doesn't even sound convincing when she says it. But, and then you see all those pictures of birds of prey on the walls, which I feel was like a visual cue as, you know, some foreshadowing of things are about to happen. These girls are about to become predatory, and they do turn predatory. At least Callie does, and eventually Holly does. Mel doesn't. She's just kind of there. The reactions of Holly and Mel to finding out they broke into someone's house are way too tame. Yeah, their reaction should have been like, what? And going nuts. Okay, I understand if maybe Mel isn't, if she's a little more even keel and trying to figure out and feeling conflicted because she's supposed to be the ego. But Holly definitely should have just been like, what? Like, strong. It was more of like a, oh, I can't believe you got us into this. Stop it, you know? But it's very serious. And they should have just been flipping out. So it doesn't feel realistic for that reason. But that is one of very few moments, or probably like the only moment that I noticed, where the characters don't feel real, or their reaction to something doesn't feel real. Well, actually, this whole thing does not feel real because people make some terrible decisions. But within the world that's been created, you can understand how they get there. And especially if you know going into it that it's this whole id, ego, superego thing, you understand why those decisions are happening. Once Arthur shows up, Arthur the man who was the housekeeper, who ends up being the body, once he shows up, you feel the tension and danger for the trio of friends. But that switches so quickly when you realize that eventually he wasn't there to cause any problems. And then you start thinking even further, oh, well, in addition to that, they had broken into this house and he's the groundskeeper there and he had every right to be there, and they certainly did not. Obviously, you naturally feel for them and you're rooting for them because they are the focus of the film. But when you step back from it, you're like, oh yeah, this is really messed up and they're actually in the wrong very much. And you start to feel for Arthur then. But your first introduction of Arthur, you're viewing him as a threat. And obviously they do too at that point. So that's why you get into the situation that you get into. And it is good for the film in general, I think, because it doesn't end up being this pure, like, pure evil, pure good situation. It becomes muddy waters, and those usually make for better stories, for me personally. Notice when Arthur dies the first time, that Callie wants to hide. She wants to hide the body. Holly wants to call the cops, and Mel is just listening and thinking through it, basically. She doesn't make any determination. So, truly being the ego in that situation, Holly going to her super ego place of, we need to do the right thing, call the cops, and Callie going to her id place of, I'm not having this affect my life. We are covering this up. I don't want to get caught. So, and then obviously Mel just standing there listening, which for that reason, it makes Mel actually a terrible character. So I think it helps for people to know that this is the id, ego, superego situation. But if people go into this movie not thinking that, I could definitely see them just being like, that's a terrible character. She literally did nothing the whole time, and there was no point to her. Because there really wasn't, if you view it that way. There was no point to her actually even being there. There really wasn't. She didn't make any decisions. She just stood there and watched everything for the most part. Yeah, she said a thing here or there, but... And for that reason, it kind of is a fail, character-wise, and writing the character-wise. Like, they could have made her a little bit better and a little more engaged in the story and actually make some decisions here or there. As in, like, listen to what Callie says, listen to what Holly says, consider it for a bit, and be the deciding factor in making a decision. Whereas, for the whole film, it feels like it was just like, here's what Holly says, here's what Callie says. Callie just steamrolls the other two, and they just do what she wants. Until obviously the very end. Now, Holly is set up as very meek, so you understand why she gets steamrolled, but Mel is not set up that way. So it doesn't really make sense that she just keeps going along with what Callie says. If she is the true ego, she would be considering both sides and finally making a decision in the end, and her decision would decide what they do. If this is a true representation of the id, ego, and superego. So for that reason, I don't think they pulled it off the best they could have. Still good. I still enjoyed it. As soon as Callie brings up the idea of saying Arthur tried to force himself on one of them, all the air gets sucked out of the room. And the audience members see it and they feel it. You see it in the expressions of the characters. You feel it in just like the weight of what's being said. And all the air just gets sucked out. And you're like, oh, things have really turned. This is a really bad point in the film where we're going to get really messed up and dark. Mel saying she'll get kicked out of law school, sure. She seems, I mean, that might be the case. But then saying her mom will kill herself, that's kind of a crazy leap to go from, I'll get kicked out of law school, to my mom will commit suicide. A little weakness in the writing there. I think that's a little bit crazy. And once again, if she's being the ego, she wouldn't have crazy thoughts like that. She would listen to what Callie and what Holly are saying. So it's this thing of like, I kind of feel like they didn't know, like they know what they wanted to do with the character of Mel, but they didn't know how to execute that character the best way to represent the ego. I think if you come up with the idea of a fake assault, you should be the person to play the victim. It didn't make sense to me that Callie was like, this is what we're going to do. And she has this plan. And then they're like, let's draw Scrabble tiles to figure out who the victim will be. No, Callie, it was your idea to fake a sexual assault. You be the fake victim. Then you own it. And I don't understand why she wouldn't do it in the first place. I mean, I guess from the aspect of like, she doesn't want to have that weighing on her conscience, but she doesn't seem to have anything weighing on her conscience at any point throughout this. So I feel like character-wise, it would have made more sense for her to just be like, I'll be the one to be the fake victim. I like the shot of Holly looking into the mirror as she stands there representing the bad decisions that are being made. When Holly just goes along with, being the fake victim and, she's ripped her shirt at this point. She's, they took Arthur's hand and scratched her. She's looking at herself in the mirror and it is literally a reflection of every bad decision that's being made right there. And it's a very weighty moment. It has a lot of gravity to it, so I really like that shot. Think about this whole thing from Arthur's perspective, especially when Holly takes her hand and puts it, we don't fully know, but she drops her underwear, so you can make some assumptions what's going on. And then you do see that he ends up opening his eyes, so that makes you think even more, what is this like from his perspective? Like, think about that. He gets knocked out, so he doesn't really know what's going on, and then he wakes up to someone taking his hand and putting it places, and that's going to be very confusing. Very confusing. Literally, you're like, what is happening? I love the scene of the girls starting to hyperventilate and work themselves up for the 911 call. It makes you think back to the opening. I kind of already talked about that. Arthur's plea for help is powerfully done. Nice work by veteran actor Larry Fessenden. Always does a really great job. I'm always happy when I see him pop up in the credits for anything, because I know his performance at least will be very good. But I do think, in general, the performances in this film were quite good. Except Ben. The character of Ben. Everyone else, good job. Arthur's comment, I should have stayed home tonight, just my luck, seems really out of place as it's during a kind of tense moment, not at all the time for attempts at any sort of humor. So I think this is kind of like a script writing misstep, in my opinion. It seemed like they were trying to inject a little bit of humor from Arthur, which doesn't make any sense because the situation he's in, he wouldn't be cracking jokes, I don't think. And what was happening at that time? Like, it just didn't make any sense. It felt very shoehorned in. It felt unnatural. And it felt like a speed bump that kind of took you out of the moment. It was just like, wait, what? Why is he so focused on trying to be funny? I don't get it. I mean, I guess you could make the assumption that he's trying to endear himself to his captors, but I don't know. At least Callie is finally willing to do the dirty work herself when she actually kills Arthur. That was a moment of like, yes, this is a terrible decision, and I can't believe this is happening, kind of. But it was also mixed with, finally, she will be the one taking the initiative on one of these ideas that she has come up with that are terrible ideas. So she will literally have blood on her hands this time, for once. Callie really does just turn into a human version of a feral animal, instinct and decision-making wise. Once she decides she's going to kill Arthur, it's kind of like she goes from being id to being like super id, where she's just like not even a civilized human anymore. And I think that's kind of reflected in the scream that she ends up making when she kills Arthur. Or no, that's the scream when she like pins Holly down because Holly wants to call the police. But yeah, like all of her actions at that point when she decides, oh, we're going to kill Arthur, just so feral. She's totally unhinged at that point. But you saw that she was kind of like spinning that way. She was working her way up to that point for a while in the film. I like the enacting of what Callie proposes as the new scenario, as she tells it this new scenario to Mel, where they're actually like showing what would happen with her idea, like how they would stage things. It's a good way to make sure the audience actually gets the full picture of what's being conveyed verbally. So usually I'm a big fan of like show don't tell, and this is like that good medium of like the character is telling another character, and additionally you're showing the path that they could be going down. I think it's very impactful. I think it was a great filmmaking decision to do that. And like I said, it makes sure that there's not really any confusion for the audience of what she's talking about doing. Holly's scream after bludgeoning Callie to death is odd. The way the scream happens and you don't expect it from her character is just really weird, but I do think there's a reason for it. I think it signals Holly's shift to taking on Callie's role since she's died, because that's how she acts with Mel afterwards. After Callie is dead, Holly starts to act stronger. It's like she's taking on a part of the id because the id is gone. She needs to fill that space. And as we saw, Callie was basically making all these decisions for Mel throughout the film. So once Callie is gone, someone has to step up and make those decisions. So Holly starts to act more aggressive in her decision making. She's less meek. And I think that scream after she kills Callie is supposed to be that signaling that she is now in the new role of Callie, basically. She's going to fill the role of superego and id at the same time for Mel. And Mel just, as usual, just goes along with whatever someone else tells her to do. She really is, when you just look at her as a character, she's an awful character, like terribly written and just terrible, but I understand the purpose of her. For the entire film, you never get the idea that a single sound decision will actually be made, especially not when Callie keeps being in the helm. You hear good ideas coming from Holly where it's like, yes, that's the way I would go. And I assume most audience members would go that way. But um, you just know that it's just going to keep being bad decision after bad decision after bad decision, especially when you're looking at the runtime and you're like, there's still a bunch of movie left. So we got to make more bad decisions. Yeah. I get the idea of the id, superego, and ego, but in this, it's not that much at play. It's really just the id dominating the whole time. To put this idea off, to pull this idea off better, they needed to have Mel make the final decisions for what to do, or at least be heard siding with one of the others when they're arguing. It seems she's more an observer than anything, and where the ego is supposed to be a decision-making factor. It's supposed to mitigate the two polarizations of the id and the superego, and Mel does not do that. She never does that. She just seems to be there as an observer. So I think they kind of misfired on making her character like that. She needed to be the decision maker, and it needed to be a situation where she's being influenced more by an argument from one of them, but being conflicted throughout the entire time when she's making decisions. They needed to have it be like a voting system where it'd be like, well, there's three of us. We need to be democratic. This is what I want. This is what I want. Mel, break the vote. They did do a good job of making the three look like their roles. Callie is strongly dressed, very kind of sexual and more aggressive looking, and kind of wild, like wild child dress. Holly looks very innocent and very meek and more conservatively dressed, and Mel looks just plain. Like, notice that, like, she doesn't have any sort of makeup on or anything like that, whereas Callie has a bunch of makeup on. Like, they literally tried to make Mel look as plain as possible, so I get it. Like, she's the ego, she's just, like, there, a plain person. So, overall, I did enjoy the film. I quite enjoyed it. I think the events are very interesting to watch unfold. I think they pulled a lot of it off well, and like I said, big props to them for doing a good runtime, like, not stretching it too much. Like, they filled the time with the story that they needed to tell, and they told it pretty well. So, out of 5 stars with half stars in play, I'm going to give this a very solid 3.5-star rating. I enjoyed it. I do recommend it. And also, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. If you've seen this film, go ahead and put in the comments, what did you think? Loved it, hated it, in between? And we can talk a little bit more about it. You know, if you disagree with certain things that I've said or agree with them or whatever, let's talk. Anyway, do me a quick favor, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. That's your way to repay me if you like this video or any video I've ever done. Literally, I don't make money doing this or anything. The payment I get is the satisfaction of seeing people subscribe and knowing that I'm building a nerdy horror community here. People are actually enjoying what I'm putting out, you know, spending my time working hard on putting out. So I appreciate that if you do subscribe. But regardless, I really do thank you for taking your time to watch this. And until next time, keep it brutal.